Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And before I get started, I just wanted to let everybody know that there's a new issue of the Pundit Files out right now. So if you expand the description of this video, you will find a link to the Red Room store where the Pundit Files live. And it's issue number 25, if you can believe it. And I wanted to do something a little bit special for issue 25. And so issue number 25 is called The Wild West Timeline. And a few years ago, I ran a campaign set in the Wild West. And this was it was not the Wild West with magic or Wild West with supernatural monsters or the Wild West in an alternate history. It was the Wild West as it actually happened, right? And for that campaign, first, when I was preparing for the campaign, I made a fairly lengthy timeline of the events in the period that is the most identifiable in our modern minds with the Wild West itself. So from the 1870s to the 1890s. And it was focused, that timeline, on places and people who were, some of the famous people of the Wild West. And the kind of action and adventure that they actually went through in real life. Yeah. And so I have now made that into issue 25 of the Pundit Files, which is a fantastic resource for any Wild West type campaign. It covers, the things that happened in Deadwood, in Dodge City, in Las Vegas, in Tombstone, and all of the many unusual characters, some of which you'll no doubt know, like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and Billy the Kid, and then some lesser known but very interesting characters that really existed in the Wild West. And so it's the sort of thing that makes for good reading, but also that if you're actually planning to use in a Wild West campaign would be pretty invaluable, I think. So be sure to check that out. Just like every other episode, every other issue of the Pundit Files, it costs $3.50. So if you can get yourself $3.50, you can buy an issue of the Pundit Files. And if that one doesn't sound your fancy, well, there's 24 others already that are just waiting for you to get on all kinds of stuff, ranging from, medieval authentic to Gonzo stuff to adventures to supplements to other sorts of references for historically authentic stuff, all kinds of things. You're bound to find an issue of the Pundit Files you're going to like. Okay, so today I decided that because somebody had asked me to explain how it is that the random generators I create are, well, basically, why are they so good? Right? Which is a nice thing for someone to ask you, actually. I was quite pleased by that. But, so I thought that today what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain why. And my, I would say the quality of my work in the creation of random generators has continued to improve as I go along with the process of making new books. So that, for example, there's some good random generators in Dark Albion and Lion and Dragon, but the ones that you see in particular in like Sword and Caravan and Baptism of Fire are set up in such a way that if you want to, if you're running kind of the default campaign for either of those, you as the DM can basically run the game with virtually no prep, because all you need to do, if the player characters are moving around in the setting, you use those tables, and all you have to kind of do is probably slightly tweak results on occasion to fit what you think makes sense for the encounter. And to do this, they can't just be regular encounter tables. So what I'm basically going to do today, first off, is to show you kind of how the sauce is made, right? And but of course, if you're perfectly happy picking up stuff like Baptism of Fire and Sword and Caravan, you don't have to know how to make it. You just have to make use of them in those campaigns. But you might want to do something similar for a different campaign. And this is one of the first points, one of the first secrets, is that random tables can't just be generic. You know, there are all kinds of random generators you can make, but the more specific you make them to a genre or to a setting, the more effective that they're going to be. It doesn't always have to be stuff like encounter tables either. So the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, for example, has a ton of random generators that create things they're not encounter generators. They're generators for doing everything from creating new races, different types of creatures, and stuff like ancient complexes or things like that. So this can be applied on many different subjects. And in fact, in both Sword and Caravan and Baptism of Fire, you have some random generators that are made for not so much encounters, but for specific types of locales you might run into. So to start with, though, let's start with the basic, with how it works. Let's say in a campaign like Baptism of Fire, right? In Baptism of Fire, let's say the characters are going on a journey, and then and in the back end of Baptism of Fire, and I'm going to probably do a video about that later because I'm still going through Baptism of Fire in my video series here. There are 3 different types of encounter tables at the basic level. So the first is if you're going on one of the relatively few major roads that cross through or around Poland at this time, because there aren't too many of those. These are the ancient big roads that are trade roads, right? There's the Amber route, the Salt route, and the Via Regia, and the Pomeranian Baltic road, right? All of those are essentially roads that are used by traders, and they are in areas that are at the very least relatively more settled, because we're talking about just coming out of the Dark Ages. So even there, if you go away, if you're more than a couple of days away from a town or a city, it becomes a pretty isolated place. But you have the table for a major road, and then you have a table for a trail, which is to say not a major trade road, but a pathway that is commonly used and has, and that is discernible. And the third role is for Wilderland encounters. So when you're going in the wilderness. And, the typical D&D structure, I guess, of a random encounter table is just kind of, you look by terrain type and you roll a die and there's a random chance of getting different types of monsters. And often those monsters are either there's an equal chance of getting any one of them, or they are maybe staggered by challenge rating or something like that, right? Now, what I do instead is that the terrain type is put in a secondary spot. The primary spot is whether you're going through a settled area or a moderately settled area or a wild area. And the tables become very different for each one. So if you're going down one of the main roads, your probable encounters are going to be either with some local peasants or a merchant caravan or bad weather, or maybe somebody else moving around through along the road. And then there are other potential encounters, including creature encounters like supernatural creatures or things like bandits or stuff like that. But I'm very careful. What you want to do is look at that table in Baptism of Fire. Look at the percentages I assign to each one, because this is part of reflecting a believable living world, right? So there's a lot of times as you're traveling that the only thing you might encounter, either nothing, because there's an entry for nothing in each one of them, that you don't encounter anything that day of significance, or something that really isn't going to be a combat encounter, though there may be other things that you can do with that, right? If you run into local peasants, that means that there might be a village nearby that isn't really on the map, and then you can go and generate a village if the characters want to go there. And if there's like a merchant caravan, then those merchants will probably know something about, if they're coming in the opposite direction from you, about the next town over, what's going on there. And there's tables for that too. So in every one of these tables, you're going to get a different set of combinations, right? If you're on a trail, the types of encounters change. You're certainly not going to get big merchant caravans, but you might get a small, kind of an independent merchant with his wagon. You're going to potentially get, you're still potentially going to meet peasants or something like that, but your chance of encountering, bandits of some kind might be higher, and yet at the same time their numbers might be smaller than if you encounter them on the main road. And then your chance of encountering creatures gets bigger. And of course, if you're in the Wilderlands, all bets are off, and that's where you end up finding really weird stuff, right? Yes, you could find, you might still find bandits or woodsmen, but they're probably pretty desperate bandits in that case. And you might run into random people, random objects, weird sights, and of course monsters. So if you get a creature encounter, when you get that, there's a set of tables that are based on encounters by terrain type. So if you're traveling along a trail in a forest, you're going to run into different types of creatures than if you encounter a creature encounter in the mountains or the hills or the plains. Now, the specific encounters will each usually have either a subtable or a mechanic to determine and to also make that encounter specifically variable also. So you could say, for example, that you might run into a random person in the woods, right? And the random person in the woods, there might be a 40% chance or a 60% chance that will either be some local peasants or local woodsmen, and then the other percentage chance, the rest of it, will be something much more unique, right? So it could be a lost child, it could be a witch, it could be, or some kind of hermit that's living in the woods, or it could be something even stranger, right? Or let's say a renegade, there you can put in all kinds of variety, right? But having those kinds of percentages allow you to create the sense that this world is a genuine world, right? That it's not, let's put it this way, the difference between a virtual world and a literary world. So a literary world is a world where it feels like you're in the plot line of a novel or a movie. Novels and movies don't act like the real world as a rule, unless you're doing a kind of slice of life film or something like that. Whereas a virtual world is a world that is meant to feel like a living world. I mean, sometimes nothing might happen, and sometimes you might have something really unusual happen. And one of the things that isn't meant to be a factor in that is power levels. So you should figure out, for example, creature encounters, as well as, the encounters of unusual things, not by, how many hit dice the creature has, but by what the rarity should be in that kind of environment. Okay? So this does mean, in true OSR sort of style, that characters might run into a monster that is definitely outmatching them, in which case they're going to have to deal with that, right? Which will probably mean trying to get away. Conversely, they might encounter opponents that are not particularly a big challenge for them, but that's okay too, Besides the first roll for, the type of area you're traveling in, and the checks for random monsters and the variables for random things, there's then other types of sub-generators. So for example, if you're in the middle of the Wilderlands in Baptism of Fire, you might run into a random village that is, isolated from everything else. And then there's a series of tables there that you use to determine, who's in charge of that village. Are the villagers pagans or Christian? What is their economy based on? What's some particularly pressing issue they might have? So that creates an adventure seed. And also the potential of some unusual characteristic of that village. It makes it feel different from other villages. All of that sort of thing creates that sense of a living world. Then you get to towns, villages, and cities. So when you get to there are tables first and foremost for events that are happening there. So there's a potential that when you get to a civilized area, something is going on in that area. And so I have a table in both Sword and Caravan and Baptism of Fire that determines, on the basis of whether it's a village, a town, or a city, different potential events that could be happening there that will, you know, give a kind of novelty or complication or possibly an adventure queue for the characters when they arrive, but also so that if you later go back to that city, then maybe something different is happening at that time, right? And it gives the sense that the world changes, that it's not just this literary world where only, or even let's say like a video game world where you know, like at least an old style video game where nothing actually happens until the characters get there, and otherwise it just remains completely static, right? So that variation is important. And of course, in towns and cities, you have random encounter tables that I create on, you know, the day and night basis. So the chances of what you encounter vary, whether it's daytime or nighttime when you're wandering around the city. But I add other stuff too. So for example, there's a table called the mission table, which is that if you're in a city and you're trying to, you know, your player characters are trying to find a job, let's say it's a mission, something to do, there's a table for who and what might provide you with a mission. And aside from that, there's also a mechanic that, you know, might not apply in every game, but that I use in both of those, which is called unwanted attention, which means that if your characters hang around in a specific town or city or village, then after a certain amount of time, which varies by just how big that city is, in that, you know, if it's a smaller city, that time is less. If it's a big city, they're less likely to be noticed as quickly. There's a point where the DM can roll to see if the authorities of the city have taken some kind of negative notice of your presence. And of course that gets heavily modified depending on the type of characters that are in the group. So that if you have, you know, if you have noblemen and holy men and things like that, you're less likely to be looked at as a potential troublemaker. But if you've got like wizards, or somebody's got like some kind of an unusual animal or monster with them, or if they've, and then what they've done also affects it, right? If they've gotten into fights, if they've been doing something illegal, if they've been creating trouble in a visible way, all of that very heavily modifies against them, and then the authorities might take action against them, you know. At the same time, there's also tables for things like nobleman attention or royal attention, right? Where if your characters do something very notable, then the person in charge might summon them up, and it might be for a good thing or it might be for a bad thing, because, you know, even if your characters do a good thing, the person in charge might see them as a threat, right? Or they might decide, hey, I want to recruit these people, you know? So all of those tables are in there. And besides that, in the appendixes, especially in the appendix of Sword and Caravan, for example, but there's some of these in Baptism of Fire too, you have randomized generators for specific places where characters might frequent, right? So well, the big one in Sword and Caravan, or the two most important ones are, maybe there's a village generator, and there is also a generator for a caravanserai, which is to say the coaching inns that were found all along the Silk Road. So when your characters get to one of the caravanserais, you can generate what type of caravanserai it is. Does it have walls? Does it have a mosque in it? Does it allow drinking or gambling or prostitution? Does it have some unusual other element, like maybe there's a Sufi shrine there, or maybe there's a marketplace, maybe it's surrounded by a village, maybe it isn't. Whether or not there's private rooms available, or if the characters are going to have to sleep in the common room. And then there's a table there for the type of people who are there at the time, right? Because obviously if you're doing this traveling campaign and people stop at these caravanserais, you're going to want to know who else is there, right? And some of them might have something interesting to say, right? So again, there it is a weighted table. And so one of the big secrets is to know how to make the proportions of the percentages the right way to make it something where there's going to be a bigger chance of getting relatively more mundane things and a smaller chance of getting more unusual things. So in a caravanserai, most of the people you're going to meet are either part of a merchant caravan, they're either the merchant themselves, porters, guards, or other things, or they're going to be people who are, you know, special envoys or stuff like that. And then there's going to be like unusual ones. So you might get an exiled nobleman who is trying to get somewhere and he's staying at the caravanserai, right? And that might be a potential adventure hook right there. And then also there's a rumors table, because that's where people trade all the information of what they've found along the road, right? And so they might find out that, oh, in the desert just south of here, there's a rumor that there's a djinn around there and that he might have treasure, and so you can turn that into an adventure. But besides that one, there's a lot of other ones. So in the Sword and Caravan book, there's similar randomizers, for example, for merchant houses, for tea houses, for opium dens, for groups of scholars, for Sufi orders, for what else? There's another one I'm forgetting, but there's multiple of these types of tables, each of which will tell you something about that group, and will tell you something about if there's like an urgent issue. Oh yeah, like mercenary companies, stuff like that, right? So they what these do is that it means that if you're going to a place and you go to, your characters go to a tea house in city number 1, it's going to look a certain way and have certain details. If you go into another tea house in city number 2, it's going to look different and have some different details, but there'll be some things that are going to be the same. So all of this, what it means is that you as a DM can actually, if you want to, you can, if you really want to, you can roll things beforehand, but if you want to, and this is what I do, I roll things up as I go along, as the characters are doing overland travel, or when they're in the city. I generate things once, when they're about to get to the city, I'll generate what the events are and things like that. And depending on what the characters do also, because that's one of the great failings of pre-prepping, is that you might prep for a bunch of stuff and then the player characters suddenly go, you know what, we're going to try to find a brothel, and you didn't plan for that, right? So suddenly you're going to have to either ad-lib freely, or you can use one of the generators, and that is the big advantage of this sort of system. So this is a really good way to do it, and I think that the problem with a lot of people have with random tables is that a lot of random tables are not done with the level of sophistication necessary, and are not done specific to the settings, right? And sometimes, if you're running kind of a basic, fantasy campaign, it can be okay, right? If all your characters are kind of doing is traveling over Wilderland to get to dungeons, then it can be a bit more simple. But if you're planning to run a campaign that has of a world that has a certain style to it, then making the encounters reflect the style and setting them up in such a way that it creates a reasonable facsimile of a virtual world means that it'll really end up looking, and I can tell you this from these campaigns that I've run myself, that as it's being run, and it's not because I'm like a master of the system or something, because these tables largely don't have a lot of game mechanics in them. They're meant to generate setting, right? And so if the tables are well made to match the setting, you end up being able to make these rolls that if the players didn't know that you were rolling at the moment, they would think, and I know this because, for example, my Sword and Caravan campaign is a virtual campaign. We're playing online, right? And so the character, some of them use the rolling script in the online program that we use, but I don't, right? I don't need to. I'm the DM, right? So I just roll on a randomizer from the DCC randomizer, which has all the dice types, and there have been times when, especially at the beginning of the campaign, before I kind of gave away the truth about it, that my players thought that there was stuff that I had planned out, right? That this was the adventure that I had pre-scripted for the day, and it wasn't. It was just me using the tables, and that allows you to become, to make it a sandbox for the DM too, right? Where instead of you trying to be the author of the world, you are the clockmaker god, and that means that all you do is make slight adjustments, but it means that also the world becomes real to you and it surprises you, and that's a very exciting way to run a game. because if you've got the right tools for it, it ends up working really, really well. So that's basically what I wanted to tell you about. If you want to know more about that, well, check out the tables in Baptism of Fire and Sword and Caravan. And again, like I said, in the Gonzo Fantasy Companion, I don't have that set up for encounters, but I have it set up for generating other things, like generating, because the Gonzo Fantasy Companion is for Gonzo Fantasy, so it's about generating completely new races and objects and robots and creatures and complexes, right? So you look at those, and the same principle applies, So check these out, and obviously check out all my other products. I've had randomized tables all the way back to Arrows of Indra, where the random tables for the Patala Underworld, I think, are really quite well done and hold up. And also in other books, like in Cults of Chaos, has the same principle of random generators, and it's really where I learned how to do this. Like, I think there's a before and after for me in terms of Cults of Chaos. When I did Cults of Chaos, I upped my whole game for this sort of thing, and it's got these random generators for creating mostly evil sects and cults and heresies, right? And like witch cults and demon worshippers and all that sort of thing, like to use as villains. But it's not just to generate like how many there are and what what are their powers or something like that. It generates what their foundation is, what their numbers are, what their leadership is, what special resources they have, what complications they have, what they want to achieve, all of that stuff, in such a way that if, for example, if you want to make a whole adventure based on these guys, or on this group that becomes the nemesis for the adventure, you can roll that up in just a few minutes, and it weaves together pretty well, and you just fill in a couple of blanks, and suddenly you have an entire adventure prepared. Okay, and that's how a lot of my adventures have been generated, so to say. Check out all of that. But again, if you want to do this yourself, you can. And if you're making a setting that's different than the sort of settings I've got, you'll want to do that. So what you'll want to do is look at those tables carefully and look at how they're structured, and then you can imitate that, but replacing, say, early medieval Poland or the Third Crusade era Silk Road with whatever your setting is about, to make it that same sense of virtual reality. So if you like this video, please share it, and please share it anywhere you think people will find it interesting or will get pissed off about it. I don't know if people are going to get too pissed off about random table generation, but you never know. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, like the video, and again, check out in the description of this video and all my videos, there's links to all of my products. One of the best ways you can support me is to check out my games, and you're not going to be sorry. If you're a gamer, you're going to enjoy them. My games have a lot of really great content, and even if you don't want to specifically run either The World of the Last Sun or Baptism of Fire, Sword and Caravan, because they're OSR, there's tons of stuff in there that you can port over into your other games, and some stuff in terms of settings similarly that you could port over even if it wasn't an OSR game, and stuff that could inspire you. So be sure to check all of my games out, and I guess we will see you next time. Currently smoking, this is a Nirip Cuddy with Argento Roots.